The Vreth called it a relic. They called us vermin. They were wrong about one of those things. Mara Osi had a bad habit of humming when she was scared. She couldn't help it, low in her throat, tuneless. The kind of sound a person makes when the body needs to convince itself it's still alive. She'd been doing it for the better part of 6 hours now, ever since the Vreth destroyer had dropped out of fold space behind them, and the sound was starting to grate on both her crewmates in ways they were too polite to mention but too honest to hide. Dex Varen wasn't polite about it. He never was. Could you stop? He didn't look up from the navigation board. His fingers moved across it with the practiced economy of a man who'd spent 15 years threading courier ships through contested space. It's like being trapped in a jar with a very anxious bee. I'm not anxious, you're humming. I hum when I think. You hum when you're terrified. Mara considered arguing. Outside the viewport, the dark between stars was clean and absolute, and somewhere in that dark, the Vreth destroyer was following them at a distance it found comfortable, a hunter's distance, the gap a predator keeps when it wants its prey to know it has no reason to hurry. She went back to humming. The third member of their crew, their engineer, their mechanic, their occasionally philosophical dead weight, Soren Kale, was lying on his back under the secondary drive housing, with his legs sticking out into the corridor and his voice echoing up through the access panel like something from the bottom of a well. For what it's worth, Soren said, I think the humming is fine. I find it soothing. You find everything soothing, Dex said. You found the Krethian blockade soothing. You said it was structurally interesting. It was. The formation they used to prevent lateral. Soren. Sorry, a pause, the clink of a tool, the soft thud of something that probably shouldn't have been hit being hit. For what it's worth, I think I can get us another 2% out of the secondary drive if I bypass the thermal governor. We'd run hot for about 6 hours before anything caught fire. Mara looked at the tactical display. The Vreth destroyer was a cold yellow diamond on the screen, steady as a planet, patient as a god. Would 2% put us in fold range before they can intercept? No, then keep the governor. Keeping the governor. She went back to humming. Dex went back to not mentioning it. The Rook, their ship, their home, a battered long-hauler courier that had survived 18 years of contested space by being too ugly for pirates to bother with and too fast for customs agents to catch, pushed on through the dark. The Trontium Tusk had been in a crate in the Rook's cargo hold for 11 days. They hadn't known what it was when they picked it up. A job was a job. Freight broker out of Delcata Station. Sealed container. Destination the Hegemony Research Outpost at Vesh 4. Payment in advance. Mara had run the standard manifest check, found nothing flagged, and loaded the crate with the same practiced indifference she brought to every cargo run. She ran a tight ship. She asked few questions. She delivered what she was paid to deliver. Then, 4 days out of Delcata, the Vreth had started following them. One ship at first, then two, then the destroyer, which didn't follow so much as position itself. Ahead and to the right, the way a shepherd positions itself relative to something it means to herd. They'd been herded for 3 days before Mara decided she was done being herded and had gone into the hold to look at the crate. What she found inside had taken some time to process. The object was roughly cylindrical, approximately 2 meters long, slightly curved, tapering at one end to a point. It was the color of old bone, and it was warm to the touch, and when she ran a scanner over it, the scanner gave her a reading that made no sense, because what it was detecting could not exist in the quantities it was detecting inside an object this size in the cargo hold of a ship this small. Trontium, the rarest element in the mapped galaxy, the theoretical foundation of the Vreth energy network, the material from which, if the xenobiologists were to be believed, the Vreth had constructed every fold-capable engine in their entire civilization. The material which, if the political analysts were to be believed, the Vreth considered sacred. The tusk, the shape was unmistakable once you knew what it was, a vast curved tooth from something that had once been alive, and was now something the Vreth treated with more reverence than they treated most. Species had been sitting in her cargo hold for 11 days, and the Vreth had known about it for at least 7. Mara had stood in the hold for a long time looking at it. Then she had gone back to the cockpit and told her crew what she'd found. Soren had immediately gone to the hold to examine it with an expression of scientific delight that she found, under the circumstances, inappropriate. Dex had looked at the tactical display and said 3 words with the quiet certainty of a man delivering a eulogy. "We're already dead." She'd argued with him then. She was still arguing with him now, 6 hours later, in the way that people argue when they aren't arguing about the thing they're arguing about. There has to be a handoff point, she said. Someone was going to take that crate from us at Vesh 4. Someone arranged the job. Someone knows what's in that crate and why it matters. And we need to find that someone because that someone has a reason to want us alive. The freight broker could be dead. The freight broker has a reputation to maintain. You think a freight broker's reputation survives contact with a Vreth destroyer? Mara looked at the screen. The yellow diamond was still there, still patient. I think whoever brokered this job knew about the Vreth and knew about the Tusk and had a plan for what to do when the Vreth showed up. I think they didn't expect us to be flying a ship with a third-generation fold drive that needed to warm up for 4 hours before it could jump. But I think the plan exists. You think a lot of things. I'm right about most of them. Dex was quiet for a moment. Then, because he was Dex and because silence was something he found physically uncomfortable. You're right about 58% of them. I've been keeping track. That's higher than you. My percentage is lower, but my things are bigger. From the access panel under the secondary drive, Soren said, "If it helps, I've been thinking about the Tusk." They both looked at the panel. "I've been reading everything we have in the database about Trontium," Soren continued. "Which isn't much, because Trontium doesn't occur naturally in quantities large enough to scan, which means everything we know about it comes from Vreth artifacts that have been examined by human xenobiologists, which means everything we know is filtered through about 17 layers of translation and assumption." Soren, the point I'm getting to, and I promise there is a point, is that Trontium has a very unusual property. It resonates, not electromagnetically, not gravitationally, in a way that we don't have good language for, because we don't have any instruments sensitive enough to measure it properly. But the Vreth can sense it. It's part of how their fold drives work. The Trontium in the drive housing resonates with Trontium elsewhere in space, and that resonance is what allows them to navigate in fold space without tearing the ship apart. "Meaning what?" Mara said. "Meaning the Tusk isn't just a sacred object. It's a navigation anchor, the largest known concentration of Trontium in human-accessible space." A pause. The sound of something being set down carefully. "It's like a lighthouse, a beacon. The Vreth have been using it to anchor their fold routes through this sector for, the documents I'm finding suggest centuries, maybe longer." The cockpit was very quiet. "And someone," Dex said slowly, "smuggled it out. Someone smuggled it out. Why? I don't know. But here's the thing that's interesting." Soren's voice had taken on the quality it got when he was genuinely excited, the quality that usually preceded either a breakthrough or an explosion, and was often both. "If the Tusk is a navigation anchor, if the Vreth fold routes in this sector are calibrated to its resonance, then moving it doesn't just inconvenience them. It breaks the routes. Any ship currently navigating via the Tusk's signal would lose its bearing. It would be like pulling the lighthouse up and moving it 100 kilometers offshore. Ships would miss their marks. Routes would be miscalculated." "That sounds bad for ships in fold space," Mara said. "Very bad, catastrophically bad, potentially. Which is why the Vreth have been following us very carefully and very patiently, rather than simply opening fire. Because if we destroy the Tusk, or if it's damaged, the routes collapse." Dex had stopped moving. He was staring at the tactical display with an expression that Mara recognized from years of working with him. The expression he got when he was thinking faster than his face could keep up with. "Every Vreth ship currently in fold space in this sector would be navigating blind, yes." Silence. "How many ships?" Mara asked. "I don't know. Their fold traffic through this sector is significant. The hegemony trade routes pass through here, military patrol schedules. I'd estimate, conservatively, several hundred ships in active fold transit at any given time." "Several hundred," Dex repeated, "at minimum." Mara looked at the yellow diamond on the tactical screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "They can't fire on us." "No. And they can't board us while we're at speed because if the Tusk is damaged in the boarding, catastrophic navigational failure across the sector, yes. So they're following us, waiting for us to stop, waiting for us to fold jump to somewhere they can intercept and board safely, yes. And whoever hired us to carry this thing knew all of this, almost certainly." Another silence, longer this time. Mara became aware that she had stopped humming at some point in the last few minutes and that her hands were very still on the armrests of her chair. She became aware of the weight of the Tusk in the hold below her, 2 meters of ancient warm bone radiating a signal she couldn't feel, but that every Vreth's ship within a light year could, the way a magnet feels the pull of north even when there's nothing else to orient by. She picked up the comms relay. Dex, get me an open channel to Delcata Station. They'll intercept it. I want them to intercept it. The Vreth called themselves the Vreth in the way that all apex species called themselves by a word that meant, in translation, simply, us, or the people, or those who are real. The humans they had encountered, when they had bothered to name them at all, called them the Vreth in the way that humans name things they don't quite understand yet, with a word that was just a sound, a label, a placeholder until something more descriptive presented itself. Sector Commander Oskel had been dealing with humans for 19 years and still found them perplexing. Not in the way that novel things were perplexing, in the way that a persistent malfunction in an otherwise reliable system was perplexing. The malfunction that recurs without explanation, that resists diagnosis, that seems to violate the underlying logic of how things work. Humans were small and fragile and brief. They had a lifespan that the Vreth considered, with some pity, little more than a geological moment. They had no bioresonance, no fold sense, no connection to the harmonic structures that underpinned all meaningful cognition and Vreth understanding. They were, in the taxonomy of things that mattered, approximately what a rock was, occupying space, occasionally obstructing navigation, possessing a certain accidental complexity but no real interiority worth considering. And yet, in 19 years, Oskel had encountered humans doing things that rocks did not do. He had encountered humans in places that rocks did not go. He had encountered humans holding things that were, by any reasonable assessment of the situation, far beyond their capacity to hold, such as now. They're broadcasting, said Vethar, his communications officer. The word Vethar used was not broadcasting. Exactly, the Vreth language made finer distinctions, but what it meant was transmitting an open signal to any receiver within range, with apparent indifference to who might be listening. Let me hear it, Oskel said. The voice that came through was a human female, low register, unhurried. The translation algorithm rendered it in the flat, slightly delayed way that all machine translation rendered the human languages, losing what the xenolinguists called prosodic meaning. The music in language, the weight that tone carried beyond the literal content of words. Oskel had studied human speech patterns long enough to hear some of that meaning himself. He heard it now in the steadiness of the female human's voice, the quality of a person who had assessed their situation and arrived, through whatever process such a brief mind could employ, at something resembling calm. What she said was, "This is the courier vessel Rook, broadcasting on all frequencies to any listening party. We are in possession of an artifact which we understand to be of cultural and navigational significance to the Vreth hegemony. We are willing to discuss the return of this artifact under terms that preserve the safety and freedom of our crew. We are aware that the Vreth destroyer currently shadowing our position cannot take hostile action without risking damage to the artifact. We are aware that we cannot jump to fold space without allowing you an intercept opportunity we are not yet willing to give you. We are aware that this is in the human idiom a standoff. We would like to talk." Silence. "Then she knows," said Vethar. "Yes." "How does she know?" Oskel considered the question. His engineer had spent an hour calculating the probability that the human crew had decoded the Trontium resonance problem from first principles in the 6 days since the Tusk had been reported missing. The probability was, in Vreth mathematics, something so small as to be effectively zero, a rounding error, a statistical ghost. And yet, "She knows," he said again, with the same flat acceptance with which he delivered all observations that required no commentary beyond their own existence. He looked at the display showing the small, ugly human ship ahead of him. He thought about the Tusk in its hold. He thought about the 263 Vreth vessels currently navigating fold space in this sector via routes calibrated to the Tusk's resonance. Vessels that would be flying blind for, he had the calculations ready, between 2 and 14 hours depending on when they entered, fold and how far along their routes they were. If the Tusk was destroyed or moved out of this sector without a gradual recalibration of the navigation matrices. He thought about the human female's voice, unhurried, arriving at calm. "Open a channel," he said. Mara had expected the Vreth to sound imposing. She'd listened to enough hegemony broadcasts to have a sense of them, the multi-layered harmonic resonance of their speech, The way a single Vreth word could carry 3 simultaneous registers of meaning that needed 4 human words to translate. And imposing had always seemed the right word for it, like hearing a cathedral sing. What came through the comms relay when the destroyer's channel opened was a single voice, and it did sound like a cathedral. A little, if the cathedral were also conveying profound weariness. Dex had provided her with a translation algorithm. 15 years of courier work in contested space meant 15 years of communicating with species that considered human standard the height of imprecision, and Dex's translation suite was the best she'd ever used. The Vreth voice came through slightly delayed, stripped of the overtones she knew it was carrying, reduced to words. "You are the captain of the vessel Rook." It wasn't a question. She decided to treat it as one anyway. "Yes, Mara Osi. I'm guessing you're the senior officer on the destroyer." "I am Sector Commander Oskel. You have something that belongs to the hegemony." "I have something that belongs to the hegemony that was placed in my cargo hold by a party I'm now understanding had very specific intentions. I didn't steal it. I was hired to carry it. The individual who hired you to carry it is no longer relevant." "Maybe. But what they were trying to accomplish might be. Someone went to considerable trouble to move your tusk. That someone knew enough about it to know that moving it would be, what's the word, destabilizing. They wanted you destabilized. You might want to know who they are." A pause, longer than she expected. "And you know who they are?" "I know who brokered the job. I know what documentation exists. I know the originating station and the routing codes in the financial trail. I was going to hand a sealed crate to a contact at Vesh 4 and not ask questions, but I'm asking questions now. What do you want in exchange for this information?" "Safe passage for my crew to any human station we designate. No pursuit, no monitoring, no reprisal. Your tusk back in your hands undamaged. A guarantee of same, in writing or in whatever format constitutes a binding commitment in hegemony law." Another pause. "You understand that we could simply wait. You cannot maintain course and fuel indefinitely. Eventually you will require resources. We have 18 days of supplies. We also have a very creative engineer who is, right now, trying to figure out whether there's a way to weaponize 2 meters of Trontium. I don't know if there is. He doesn't know if there is. But I know that you don't know either. And I know that the uncertainty is uncomfortable for you." She heard something in the transmission that the translation algorithm couldn't render, but that she had learned, in 15 years, to recognize in any species. The quality of silence that meant the other party was thinking about something it hadn't thought about before. "You are attempting to create leverage from ignorance," Oskel said finally. "I'm attempting to create leverage from honesty. I don't know what my engineer can do with your tusk. That's genuinely true. But I know he's trying, because that's what he does. He takes things apart to see how they work, and sometimes when he figures out how they work, he figures out how to make them work differently. You are a courier. You move freight. I move freight in contested space. I've been doing it for 15 years. To do that, you have to be very good at assessing situations and very honest about what you can and can't do, because in contested space the cost of self-deception is usually a hull breach." She let a breath out. "I'm not deceiving you. I'm not bluffing. I want to make a deal and I want to go home. That's all I've ever wanted to do." The pause this time was long enough that Dex shot her a look. She held up one finger. "Captain Osi," Oskel said finally, and she heard something in the resonance beneath the word that the algorithm couldn't translate but that felt, in her chest, like the shift of tumblers in a very old lock. "We will discuss terms." The negotiation took 4 hours. Soren spent those 4 hours in the hold, not because he'd been asked to, not because Mara had actually meant it about trying to weaponize the tusk. She hadn't, or hadn't meant it as anything other than tactical uncertainty, which was different. But because Soren was constitutionally incapable of being in the same room as a thing he didn't understand without trying to understand it, and the Trontium tusk was the most interesting thing he had ever been in the same room with by an enormous margin, and the hold was quiet, and nobody was arguing in the hold, and the tusk was warm. He sat beside it with his scanner and his notebook and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago, and he worked. The resonance was real. His instruments weren't sensitive enough to measure it directly, but they were sensitive enough to measure its effects. The tiny perturbations in local electromagnetic fields, the slight gravitational anomaly, the way certain frequencies of light bent fractionally around the tusks, as if space itself were paying attention. He cataloged everything carefully in his notebook, in the precise, unadorned handwriting that had been drilled into him by an engineering instructor who'd believed that the quality of your penmanship was correlated with the quality of your thinking. The tusk was old, much older than any instrument reading could capture precisely, but old in the way that certain materials were old, not just aged but settled, the molecular structure carrying the weight of millennia in the arrangement of its atoms. He'd read everything available on Trontium in their database over the past 24 hours. What was available was sparse and technical and filtered, as he told the others, through layers of xenobiological translation. But the sparse technical details had begun to assemble themselves in his mind into a shape he found troubling. Trontium wasn't just a navigation material. It wasn't, at base, a material at all in the way the databases described it. The Vreth didn't use it. They felt it. Their fold drives didn't work because the Trontium emitted a signal that the drives detected and processed. They worked because the Trontium was, in some way that human physics didn't have good models for yet, actually structuring space around it, creating a topology, a consistent underlying geometry that Vreth's senses were attuned to the way a human ear was attuned to sound. The fold routes weren't navigational paths. They were more like grooves worn into a surface. They were real in a way that made human fold navigation, which was computation-based and entirely artificial, look like following a map while the Vreth were growing up here, knowing the land in their bodies. And the tusk was the center of the structure. It wasn't a beacon. It was more like... Soren searched for the right metaphor and then stopped searching, because the right metaphor was simply the word he'd been avoiding, a keystone. The routes didn't run toward it, they ran through it. The tusk wasn't navigational infrastructure. The tusk was the place where the structure was anchored into reality. He put down his scanner and looked at the tusk for a long time. Then he picked up the scanner again and checked the reading he'd been taking every 30 minutes since he'd come into the hold. The resonance was changing, not because of anything he'd done. He'd been careful not to touch the tusk, careful to keep his instruments at a respectful distance, careful with the same instinctive care he gave everything he didn't understand. But the resonance was changing anyway, a slow, gradual shift in frequency, like a string being wound tighter or like a tide coming in. Whatever was happening, it had been happening before he got here. Maybe it had been happening for days. He thought about what that might mean. He thought about the fold routes, the topology, the keystone. He thought about the very careful patience of the Vreth destroyer outside. He thought about what he was going to have to tell Mara. He hoped the negotiation was going well. It was going well, as negotiations with ancient spacefaring empires went. The Vreth were, Mara had discovered over the course of 4 hours, very precise. They had a quality that she would have called, in a human, lawyerly, not in the negative sense, the bad faith technical reading sense, but in the original sense, the sense of a tradition that had developed its precision, because imprecision had cost things that mattered. Every term she proposed was examined from 6 angles. Every concession was extracted with the same methodical care. She found it, to her surprise, almost restful. There was no anger in it, no contempt, just the exhaustive patience of a civilization that had been doing this long enough to know that the words mattered and that haste was its own kind of imprecision. Askel, she was coming to think, was good at this. Not just experienced, but genuinely good. The kind of negotiator who understood that the goal wasn't to win but to produce a document that would hold. They were on the 5th revision of the safe passage guarantee when Soren's voice came through the internal comms. Mara, I need to talk to you. I'm in the middle of something. I know, this is more important. She held up a hand at the communications panel, a gesture Askel couldn't see, meant entirely for Dex, who understood it and nodded and began filling in transitional text to buy her a minute. She switched to internal comms. What? The tusk is resonating differently than it was when we picked it up. I've been tracking it for the last 3 hours. What does that mean? I'm not entirely certain. But based on the rate of change and what I understand about how Trontium structures work, Mara, I don't think the tusk is stable. She kept her voice very flat. Define not stable. It's been out of its native position for 11 days. Whatever the Vreth do to maintain these structures. Regular harmonic calibration, probably, physical proximity of their operators. I'm speculating here, it hasn't been done. The resonance is degrading, slowly, but measurably. How long? Before it becomes critically unstable. At current rate, maybe 6 days, maybe less, and critically unstable means, in a worst case, the topological structure it's maintaining collapses. All those fold routes that are calibrated to it don't just go inaccurate. They go, the word I keep coming back to is wrong. They go actively wrong. Ships currently navigating via Tusk-calibrated routes don't just lose their bearings. They get the wrong bearings. They navigate confidently into positions that aren't where they think they are. She was quiet for a long moment. Soren? Yes. Does Oskel know this? I don't know. Probably. He's watching the same resonance readings we are, actually. His instruments are almost certainly better than ours. But he might not know how advanced the degradation is. He might think he has more time than he does. Or he might know exactly how much time he has, and that's why he agreed to negotiate. That's also possible. She stayed quiet a moment longer, looking at the tactical display where the yellow diamond was still patient, still steady, still waiting. She thought about Oskel's voice, unhurried, exhausted, precise. The quality of a person who had assessed their situation and arrived, through whatever process such an ancient mind could employ, at something resembling calm. He knows, she said. How can you? We're running out of time faster than either of us has admitted out loud, and he knows it. And he agreed to negotiate because he needs this done quickly, and he needs the Tusk handled by people who understand what they're holding. He's been patient because patience is what he does, but underneath it he's scared. A silence. What do we do? Soren asked. Mara thought about the negotiation. She thought about the 5 revisions and the precision and the careful words and the weight of a civilization that had been doing this long enough to know that words mattered. She thought about 18 days of supplies and a fold drive that needed 4 hours to warm up and a yellow diamond on a tactical screen that could close the distance between them in about 40 minutes if it decided it had nothing left to lose. She thought about what it meant to be a courier, what it actually meant underneath the logistics and the fuel calculations and the contested space navigation. You took a thing from one place to another. You kept it safe in transit. You put it in the hands of whoever it was meant to reach. That was the job. That was all the job had ever been. We do the deal, she said, and then we tell him what we know. The degradation, Oskel said when she told him. You know about the degradation. My engineer has been sitting in the hold with your Tusk for 4 hours. He knows about a lot of things now. And you are telling me this, despite the leverage it would seem to give you. You are telling me this. I'm telling you this because we have a deal on the table, and the deal is good, and I want it to hold. And it won't hold if I let you think we have more time than we do. And then the Tusk degrades and the routes collapse and hundreds of ships come to grief in fold space because I wanted extra leverage. She paused. Also, my engineer would never forgive me. He has strong feelings about this kind of thing. The pause was shorter this time. You are a very unusual courier, Captain Osi. I'm a courier who's been in contested space for 15 years. You develop strong feelings about keeping your word. The degradation can be reversed. If the Tusk is returned to a Vreth technician within the next 48 hours, the resonance can be stabilized and the routes protected. If we do not receive it within that window, then we need to move fast. Can you fold a shuttle to our position without using the Tusk signal for navigation? Yes. Our emergency navigation protocols are computation-based, similar to your own systems. Slower and less precise, but functional. Then let's finish this draft and let's move. My engineer tells me there's a harmonic calibration window every 6 hours, a point in the resonance cycle where the degradation slows for about 20 minutes. He thinks if you receive the Tusk during that window and begin stabilization, immediately you'll have enough margin. A very long pause. Your engineer determined from 4 hours in the hold with consumer-grade instruments. He also figured out how a Crethean fold jammer worked by looking at it for 3 hours and then bypassed it with a piece of wire and a modified cargo manifold. He's good at this. You are a crew of 3, a courier, a navigator, and an engineer. Yes. And the engineer, he understands what the Tusk is, not just the mechanics, what it is, a word that the translation algorithm gave her as the real substance of it, which she knew was wrong but was the best the algorithm could do. She thought about Soren in the hold, sitting beside something ancient and warm with his notebook and his cold tea, cataloging everything carefully. He's starting to. Give him a couple more hours. I find, Oskel said, and there was something in his voice now that the translation algorithm rendered as uncertainty, but that she heard, in the space between words, as something larger and older than uncertainty, something closer to the feeling she got when she navigated by dead, reckoning through a debris field and came out exactly where she'd calculated. Not because the instruments had told her she would, but because she'd felt the root. I find that humans are. I have spent 19 years thinking of you as I think of rocks, present, structural, occasionally obstructive. I have been imprecise. That's all right, Mara said. We've been thinking of you as not rocks exactly, more like weather, vast and impersonal and not really aimed at us. And now, she looked at the tactical screen, the yellow diamond, patient, scared, precise. Now you're a sector commander trying to get his lighthouse back before the ships run aground. She let a breath out. Send the shuttle. We'll have the Tusk ready for transfer. The shuttle arrived in 40 minutes, as Oskel had said it would. It was smaller than Mara expected. She'd imagined Vrethtech as enormous, somehow everything scaled to the grandeur of a civilization that thought in centuries. The shuttle was functional and compact, about twice the size of the Rook's emergency pod, and it matched velocity with them with a precision that made Dex grudgingly nod. 2 Vreth technicians and 1 security officer came aboard through the docking collar, and they brought instruments that Soren's eyes tracked with an intensity that Mara recognized from his expression around interesting machines. The Vreth were taller than humans by about a head. Their secondary limbs, the hegemony's official diplomatic materials called them resonance limbs, which everyone knew was a diplomatic euphemism for something that their biology did and that humans couldn't, folded flat against their torsos when they moved through the Rook's corridors, making them look, in the cramped human space, oddly humble. Their faces read as faces in the way that all bilateral symmetry read as something familiar. The senior technician went straight to the hold without being directed there, following the Tusk's signal the way a bird follows north. Soren was waiting in the hold. He had his notebook open. The Vreth technician stopped when it saw him and looked at him for a long moment and then at the notebook. What happened next? Mara watched from the hold entrance and couldn't entirely follow, because most of it happened in a language she didn't have and via instruments she couldn't read. But the shape of it was clear enough. Soren showed the technician his readings. The technician looked at them, looked at Soren, looked at the readings again, then produced its own instruments and began doing something that was clearly the same thing Soren had been doing, and then stopped and looked at Soren again and said something. The translation algorithm rendered it as, "You measured the harmonic window." Soren said, "I wasn't certain I had the right frequency range. The third peak in the cycle, is that the primary stabilization window or is that an artifact of?" The Vreth technician said something that the algorithm rendered as, "That is the secondary window. The primary is 14 minutes earlier." That would explain the variance was seeing at the yes. Soren picked up his notebook and started writing something. The Vreth technician watched him write. Then it reached into a pouch at its side and produced a tool that looked, to Mara's untrained eye, like a very elegant version of the calibration wand Soren used on the fold drive, and began running it along the length of the Tusk in slow, careful passes. "Is it?" Mara started. "Beginning stabilization," the technician said, in human standard to her considerable surprise. The accent was heavy, but the words were clear. "The window is in 11 minutes. Your engineer correctly identified the degradation slope. He usually gets the math right," Mara said. The technician continued the slow passes along the Tusk. Soren continued taking notes. The security officer stood near the hold entrance and looked at Mara with an expression she couldn't read, but that didn't feel hostile. Dex had stayed in the cockpit because Dex didn't trust himself not to say something unfortunate, which was, she thought, a form of self-knowledge she found touching. "The window," Soren said suddenly. He was looking at his instruments. It's early. The frequency is, I think my timing model was off." The Vreth technician checked its own instruments, looked at Soren, said something rapid in Vreth. Soren looked at his notebook, at his instruments, at the technician. Then he said calmly, with the absolute absence of drama that Mara had always found most impressive about him in moments of actual crisis, "The window is in 90. Seconds, and it's going to be shorter than I calculated. Maybe 12 minutes instead of 20. The Vreth technician said 2 words that the algorithm rendered as, "Initiate now," and then began moving along the tusk with a speed and precision that was clearly practiced and clearly urgent, the wand tracing patterns Mara couldn't follow. The tusk beginning to emit something she couldn't hear but could feel at the back of her teeth. A vibration just below the threshold of sound, like a string held after the note was done. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. The technician didn't answer. Soren said, without looking up from his instruments, "Watch the 3rd reading on my scanner. Tell me if it drops below 0.72. She picked up the scanner, watched the reading. "It's at, I know. Tell me if it drops." The vibration deepened. She felt it in her sternum now, in the way you felt the bass of a very powerful speaker before you heard it. The tusk was warming, not metaphorically. She could feel the temperature rising in the hold from 2 meters away, the warmth of an old bone becoming the warmth of something recently alive, as if the tusk remembered, in whatever way a thing could remember, what it had been before it was an artifact, before it was a keystone, before it was infrastructure. 0.81, she said. "Good." Soren's voice was steady, stabilizing. 0.83. The Vreth technician said in human standard without looking up. Soren glanced at it just for a moment. Then, "Thank you." 0.86, it said. The vibration was everywhere now, in the bones of the ship, in Mara's molars, in the space between breaths. The hold was warm and the tusk was glowing faintly its tip, a pale bioluminescence that she was fairly sure it hadn't been doing before. A soft blue-white light that didn't illuminate so much as clarify. The way a first detail in a developing photograph clarifies, not adding brightness but adding definition, making the shapes of things slightly more exactly themselves. 0.9, she said. Soren exhaled. A long, quiet sound. That stabilized. The technician ran 3 more passes along the tusk, checked its instruments, said something in Vreth that the algorithm rendered as, "The degradation is arrested. Secondary resonance is rebuilding." Then it straightened and looked at Soren and said, in human standard, "How did you measure the harmonic window?" It wasn't a question either. Soren looked at his scanner and his notebook and the cold tea he'd apparently brought to the hold at some point and said, "I just paid attention to what was there." The technician looked at him for another long moment. Then it made a gesture that Mara didn't know the meaning of, but that Soren apparently did. He made one back, slightly uncertain. The way you repeat a phrase in a language you're just learning. The technician's posture shifted in a way she couldn't describe as anything other than satisfied. The transfer took another hour. The crate the tusk left in was Vreth-made and resonance-shielded and cost more, Mara estimated, than the Rook had cost to build. The Vreth security officer helped carry it, which she hadn't expected. Dex helped too, which she also hadn't expected, though she suspected his motives were more about not wanting anything dropped than any particular spirit of cooperation. Oskel came through the comms as the shuttle was preparing to undock. "The roots are stabilizing," he said. "The secondary resonance cascade will take approximately 6 hours to complete. The routes will be fully functional by morning." "Good," she said. "The individuals responsible for the theft of the tusk will be identified. I believe you have documentation that would assist in that identification. I'll transmit it when you're clear of docking. Captain O.C." A pause. "The engineer, Kale." "Yes." His name. In Vreth, the construct he used for the harmonic measurement, the approach, the framework, we have a word for it, for the quality of attention required to do what he did, with what he had, in the time he had. She waited. The word is Veth Os Ren. There is no precise human equivalent. The closest translation your algorithm will give you is the sight that sees without instruments. But that is imprecise. The word means more precisely the specific human quality of a pause, longer than any pause she'd heard from him. The specific quality of a mind that finds the structure of the world through patient looking, that earns its understanding not through birth but through the accumulation of mornings, through the choosing to notice things. She thought about Soren in the hold with his notebook and his scanner and his cold tea, cataloging everything carefully. "I'll tell him," she said. "He may not find it meaningful. The word is Vreth." He'll find it meaningful. She was sure of that. Safe travels, Oskel. Safe travels, Captain. The shuttle undocked. Through the viewport, she watched it move away, and then the destroyer's fold drive engaged and the yellow diamond on her tactical screen blazed briefly into something larger and more complex. A rose of light, a topology unfolding, ancient roots through ancient dark, and then it was gone, and the display was clean, and the space ahead of them was open. Dex said, "Huh," she said. "Yeah." Soren came up from the hold and stood in the cockpit doorway with his notebook under his arm and looked at the clean display and then at both of them and said, "I'm going to need a new word for my Vreth glossary." They were a day out of Delcata. The Rook hummed to itself, 3 notes of a very old engine finding its frequency in the dark. 3 weeks later, the freight broker who had arranged the job was found and detained. His name was Hendrix Calloway, and he was, it turned out, an operative for a hegemony border pressure group called the Void Compact, a loose organization of human polities and independent operators who had been trying for the better part of a decade to destabilize Vreth navigational infrastructure as leverage in a series of territorial disputes that had been dragging through hegemony arbitration for longer than Mara had been flying. The Trontium Tusk had been stolen by a Void Compact asset with access to a Vreth research station. The plan had been to hold the Tusk for 30 days while the navigational collapse in the sector created catastrophic fold failures, which the Compact expected to leverage into territorial concessions. The 30 days had been calculated based on an inaccurate model of Trontium degradation rates. Nobody in the Compact had access to the actual Vreth data on how quickly an unattended Tusk destabilized. Soren had been given access to that data via a formal hegemony research accord signed in his name 3 days after the shuttle docked. He'd spent a week reading it with an expression that people who'd known him for years described as his most frightening look. The look of someone who has just understood something that was previously beyond understanding and is now processing what understanding it means. The Vreth hegemony had, to the considerable surprise of most human diplomatic analysts, offered a formal commendation to the crew of the Rook. This was unusual enough that 3 separate news services had asked Mara to comment on it, and she had told all 3 the same thing. "We're couriers. We do the job, we go home." What she didn't tell the news services was what Oskel had said to her in a private channel the day the Compact operative was identified. What he'd said was, "The Compact believed that the collapse of our fold routes would make us vulnerable. They did not understand that what they had done was put our routes in the hands of a human who would notice how they worked." She'd asked what he meant by that. They believed that the Tusk's removal would simply cause failure, darkness, the absence of function. They did not consider that the person carrying it might look at it, that the looking might become understanding, that the understanding might become preservation. He'd used a word at the end that the algorithm had stumbled over for a full 3 seconds before rendering it as care. She thought the algorithm was probably wrong about the translation, as it often was about Vreth words that were doing more than one job at once. But she didn't think it was entirely wrong. She thought about it sometimes, in the months that followed, in the way that certain things settle into the back of the mind and become part of the way you see other things. Not a thought you return to, consciously, but a lens you forget you're wearing. The Vreth had built their roots through human space over centuries. They had made their calculations in a language of resonance and topology that humans didn't have instruments to read. They had looked at humanity and seen rocks, structural, obstructive, not without a certain accidental complexity, but without real interiority worth considering. And into the custody of those rocks they had placed, by the accident of a freight broker's scheme, the keystone of their civilization's most critical infrastructure in this sector. What the Compact had been betting on was that the rocks would drop it. What nobody had bet on, not the Compact, not the Vreth, not honestly the 3 of them on the Rook in those first hours after she'd opened the crate, was that the rocks would sit down beside it and start taking notes. That a human engineer with consumer-grade instruments and a notebook and a cup of tea going cold would find, in 9 hours of patient looking, the harmonic window that the Vreth technician needed. That a human navigator would spend 15 years developing a translation algorithm precise enough to hear the emotional weight in an alien sector commander's voice. That a human courier would understand without being told. That the moment to be honest is the moment you have the most to gain from lying, Because the value of the deal you make honestly is worth more than any advantage you take in the short term. These were not big things. They were not the things history noticed, or at least not the history that got written down. They were the small accumulations, the choosing to pay attention, the building of precision, the understanding that words mattered because imprecision had costs and honesty was its own kind of leverage. These were not impressive things, in the scale of a civilization that thought in centuries. They were not the things that made aliens look at humanity and recalibrate their hot, fundamental category for what humanity was, except that they were, apparently, exactly that. 6 months after the Rook's encounter with the Vreth destroyer, Sector Commander Oskel filed a report with Hegemony Intelligence that was, in the dry accounting of official documentation, described as a reassessment of navigational security protocols in human proximate sectors. The report contained a new category, not for human vessels, not for human technology, not for human political entities or border disputes or the various messy complications of a species that had been in fold-capable space for less than 2 centuries and was still, by most Vreth assessments, considerably louder and more chaotic than the situation required. The new category was for human crews operating in contested space. The distinction from human vessels in general was, in the bureaucratic language of hegemony documentation, described as vessels whose operators have demonstrated Vethos Ren quality in direct contact with hegemony material or interests. What it meant in practice was, when you encountered one of these ships, you did not assume rocks. You assumed the sight that sees without instruments. You assumed the accumulation of mornings. You assumed the choosing to notice things. There were 3 ships on the list when it was filed. The Rook was first. Mara didn't know about the list for another 8 months, when a hegemony diplomatic liaison mentioned it to her during a supply stop at Vesh 4. She was loading cargo at the time, a sealed container, standard manifest check, no flags, and the liaison found her in the hold and told her what Oskel had done. She listened, she thought about it. Then she went back to loading cargo. When the liaison asked if she had a comment, she said, "We're couriers. We do the job. That's it." She thought about a Vreth technician saying, .83. In careful human standard, the numbers of a shared measurement passing between species in the language that was common to them, the language of patient watching and careful counting, and the specific quality of attention that looked at the world and found, in the looking, what was actually there. She thought about Soren's notebook, Dex's translation algorithm, a warm artifact in a cold hold, glowing faintly at its tip in a light that didn't illuminate so much as clarify. "We do the job," she said. "We go home." She went back to loading cargo. Down in the hold, Soren was running a standard scan on the sealed container. He'd been doing this, running scans before accepting cargo, for about 4 months now, quietly, without anyone asking him to. His scanner had been modified twice in that period to extend its sensitivity range. His notebook had 3 new sections. One of them was labeled, in his careful engineer's handwriting, with a Vreth word that meant more than its translation. Outside, in the space between stations, ships moved on routes that held because someone had sat beside a keystone with cold tea and noticed how it worked. The dark was full of fold routes and patient civilizations, and the occasional human courier finding their way between the stars by the accumulation of attention. It was in the end a very human thing to do, and no one had ever adequately explained to any species that encountered it why that was. In the long accounting of the galaxy, sufficient and more than sufficient, and sometimes, when the stakes were right and the window was brief, and the instruments were inadequate to the task, exactly what was needed. They had only ever had to demonstrate it. They were getting quite good at that.